What's up everyone? Nick LaSalette here, and this behind me is the city of Fredericksburg, Virginia. If you know anything about the Civil War, you'll know that this is the site of one of the most iconic and one of the most lopsided battles of the Civil War. Just here below the city in front of me is the Rappahannock River. So a little bit of background. It's winter, 1862. Just a few months earlier in September, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had invaded north into Maryland and was stopped by the Army of the Potomac at Antietam. However, General McClellan, who was the commander of the Army of the Potomac at the time, failed to pursue Lee's forces as they retreated back into Virginia. And for that, Lincoln had finally had enough and he fired George McClellan. And in his place, he put General Ambrose Burnside. And Burnside came up with a plan to come here to Fredericksburg, to cross the Rappahannock River, capture this town before Lee's forces could arrive to reinforce it and to build defenses, and move on into Virginia to get behind Lee's army and catch him by surprise. So when they arrived here, the army moved out on November 15th and arrived here shortly thereafter and waited for 10 days for the pontoon bridges, it's a good example of that right here, to be delivered by the War Department. And there's a lot of debate on who's to blame for that, whether it was Burnside or Henry Halleck, the head of the War Department. Nevertheless, they waited while the Union Army was on this side of the river. Robert E. Lee had time to bring his army here and to start to build defenses. So by the time that Burnside got those pontoon bridges and he was able to cross the river, it was already too late. Thus will begin one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. So during the preparation for the attack on Fredericksburg and during the battle itself, General Burnside and his staff made their headquarters right here. This is Chatham Manor. It's a beautiful location. So they definitely had a little cozy spot to look over the city while the operations were going on. And during the preparation, the city was bombarded. There was, I believe, around 150 guns that were bombarding Fredericksburg in the days leading up to the assault. And actually, 10% of this city was destroyed during the bombardment. So when Burnside's army finally received those pontoon bridges from the War Department, they began to build 3 crossings, and right here would be the uppermost crossing. At around dawn on December the 11th, the Union engineers began to construct the pontoon bridges. There were 2 of them right here. However, the engineers came across a massive problem when they were building the bridges. In these houses just behind the camera, in the windows and in the cellars, a brigade of Mississippians under William Barksdale they were defending the town, and they were using these houses to fire down on the engineers as they were trying to build those bridges, picking them off one by one. So that day, December the 11th, when the pontoon bridges were about halfway done, Burnside said, "That's enough. We need to get a regiment across this river as quick as possible to clear out these houses to allow the engineers to continue their work." And that job would go to the 7th Michigan Regiment. And the 7th Michigan took the pontoon boats that weren't actually meant to carry men and to be rowed, but regardless, they climbed into the boats, rowed across this river, and began to move into the town to clear out these houses of Confederates. And actually, that crossing was the first amphibious crossing under fire in American history. So the men of the 7th Michigan Regiment moved up this street right here. This is Hawk Street. And they began to move house by house, clearing out Barksdale's Mississippians as best they could. Each side was not really prepared for urban combat. Nobody had been trained in this before, so they were kind of making it up as they went. But they were successful in clearing out this area of the town, and they were followed up behind them by the 19th Massachusetts and the 20th Massachusetts. And those three regiments fanned out and were able to clear out Fredericksburg of Barksdale's Mississippians. So right here on Hawk Street and the intersection of Caroline Street, right up there, is where Barksdale's Mississippians began to put up a bit more of a concentrated defense. And so the progress kind of slowed for those regiments as they made their way up that way. And just a quick little thing I wanted to note is that this brick wall was there during the battle. Most of these houses here have been rebuilt since because of the extensive damage that they took during the battle. But this wall was here, and the 7th Michigan used this wall to take cover from Barksdale's men as they began to pour fire down this way. So as the 7th Michigan and the 19th and 20th Massachusetts came up this way into the town of Fredericksburg, the 20th Massachusetts passed the 7th Michigan here on Hawk Street and made it to this intersection of Caroline Street. And it was here that Barksdale's Mississippians in these second-story windows were firing down into the intersection, as the 20th Massachusetts put one company here to block that side, another company there to block that one, and one company here, kind of like in a square formation. And the fire coming from Barksdale's Mississippians from these second-story windows caused about 100 casualties just in this small little intersection right here. So by the time night fell on the 11th of December 1862, the Mississippians under William Barksdale had withdrawn from the town and moved up towards the defenses on Meads Heights. And the pontoon bridges across the river had been completed. Burnside's army was crossing in force, and the Union Army occupied this town. And that night, out of frustration, I guess, the Union troops began to loot and destroy everything that they could. And it was something that the civilians of Fredericksburg remembered for the rest of their lives. This is Prospect Hill. This is the southern end of Lee's defensive line here at Fredericksburg. This half of the defenses was taken up by General Stonewall Jackson's corps. In that direction, up closer to Fredericksburg, would have been A.P. Hill's division, and this on the Confederate, the Confederate right flank would have been Jubal Early's division. And to understand what happened here on December the 13th, you have to look at the previous day, December the 12th. So as we know, the Union Army crossed into Fredericksburg on December the 11th, and on the 12th, it wasn't really a day of any action. It was more of a day of preparation for both sides as the Union tried to figure out what they were going to do to try and break Lee's lines here and at Meads Heights. And Lee had time to build his defenses here. You could still see some of them today, some of these trenches and earthworks, which I think are super cool. Anyways, that day, December the 12th, Burnside and all of his subordinates, his corps commanders and his division commanders, they all met, discussed their plans, and basically General Sumner's Grand Right Division, which was going to be attacking Meads Heights, they were going to be launching what they thought was going to be a secondary attack to support the main effort, which was going to be here by Franklin's Left Grand Division, which was going to be the main attack apparently on December the 13th. So they all went to their respective commands that night on December the 12th, with Burnside saying, "You will receive your orders soon." And nobody received any orders until early the next morning. So nobody had any time to get their men in position to be ready to attack in the first place. And to make it all worse, what was going to be a main attack here at Prospect Hill ended up being the secondary attack. And the attack at Meads Heights was going to be the main show of the battle. So in the morning of December 13th, somewhere between 7:15 and 7:45 in the morning, General Franklin received his orders from Ambrose Burnside, and they were vague, to say the least. He thought, like I said, that this was going to be the main show, but instead, Ambrose Burnside's order said to keep your command ready for an attack, but send at least one division to take the heights here at Prospect Hill. And for one reason or another, I guess Franklin, being a really practical man, sent one division. And that one division was going to be the smallest division in his corps, his Grand Division. That was going to be General Meads Division of about 4,500 men. They were going to attack up this hill to try and dislodge the Confederates, while General Gibbon's division was going to follow up on Meads' right, and General Doubleday's division was going to be holding General Meads' left to try and make sure that no Confederate forces would roll up his flank. So on the morning of December 13th, there was a thick layer of fog that blanketed the entire battlefield, making it impossible for either side to really see each other. So Meads' division waited until the fog lifted to make their attack, which was around 10:30 in the morning. At 10:30, they moved out, moved up this way towards Prospect Hill, and the Confederates, the previous day, December the 12th, had pre-sighted the field in front of them, and they waited until Meads' men were 800 yards from their guns before they let rip. And when they did, Meads' division was stopped in its tracks momentarily and suffered heavy losses. But through sheer tenacity, Meads' division pushed forward inch by inch, and almost by mistake, by sheer luck, they came across an area of Jackson's defensive line that was thinly held because of a patch of marshy, swampy ground that was impossible to place guns. And because it was a cold December morning, there weren't really any troops on the Confederate side that were willing to stay in that area to defend it. So Meads' men found this area, were able to punch through it, and spanned out to attack the brigades on either side. And for a moment, it looked like the Confederate line was going to break. But the Confederates were quick, they reacted to it quickly, and they sent in reinforcements from their rear to plug the gap. And eventually, unfortunately for Meads' division, they were pushed back to their starting line and had achieved nothing at the cost of many men. On Meads' right, Gibbon's division, they were trying to cross the field in front of Prospect Hill as well, but unfortunately for them, there wasn't any swampy ground that the Confederates weren't willing to occupy. The ground was a little bit more open in front of them, so they suffered heavy losses as well, and were also pushed back. So by the end of the day, on December 13th, the attack here at Prospect Hill, it could have broken the Confederate lines, but because of General Franklin not supporting Meade or Gibbon's division, it was fruitless. And at the cost of around 3,500 casualties for the Union side here, they achieved nothing. I'm standing now at Mary's Heights here at Fredericksburg, and the ground here in front of me saw some of the most gruesome carnage pretty much of the whole Civil War. This was attacked by General Sumner's Right Grand Division on the morning of December 13th, 1862. The Confederates were lined up down there at the famous stone wall, 4 ranks deep. Their artillery would be lined up pretty much where I'm standing here at the very height of Mary's Heights. And the heights here were attacked by many divisions. It was French's division, Hancock's, Getty's, Griffin, Humphreys, Howard's division. All of those divisions tried to make their way up this hill to break the Confederate lines, and not a single unit got closer than 100 yards, or 100 paces, they said, of the stone wall itself. By the end of the night, there was 8,000 Union casualties spread out all throughout that ground in front of me. So I'm here at the stone wall. From the Confederate perspective, this is where they would have been lined up, pouring lead into the ranks of the Union soldiers as they tried to come up Marye's Heights. Just up there is where the Confederate artillery would have been placed. And these men had a commanding view over the open ground in front of me here. All of these buildings and modern infrastructure were not there during the battle. This would have been open ground for hundreds of yards. So it's a little unfortunate they've encroached so close to the battleground. I don't know why someone would want to live in a house that's built on top of where so many men died, but if you use your imagination, you can still put yourself there. Like I said, the closest unit, or the unit that got closest to the stone wall, made it about 100 paces before they were cut down, and that was the Irish Brigade in Hancock's division. Out of about 1,200 men in that brigade, they lost almost half before they were forced to retreat. It must have been a terrible place to be. This statue right here behind me commemorates the actions of Sergeant Richard Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina that was defending this stone wall here at Marye's Heights in Fredericksburg on December 13th, 1862. Now, when the night came that day, after 14 separate charges made by the Union Army to try and break the Confederate lines here, all of which being failures, like I said, there were 8,000 Union casualties sprawled out all throughout this ground here. And the Confederates that were still behind the stone wall throughout the night were forced to listen to the moans and groans and the cries of the suffering wounded that were laying out here throughout that night. And after a while, Richard Kirkland simply couldn't take it anymore, and so he went to all of his men, asked for their canteens of water, jumped over the stone wall, and went to every single wounded Union soldier that he could to give them water, to comfort them, to be there with them while they were suffering. And for his actions, both the Union and the Confederates nicknamed him the Angel of Marye's Heights. I'm standing on top of what's called Lee's Hill. This is the site of General Robert E. Lee's headquarters during the Battle of Fredericksburg. From here, he could see the battle going on down there at Marye's Heights, and also over there at Prospect Hill. None of these trees, of course, would have been there during the battle, so he would have had an open view of the entire battlefield from here. This is the spot where he made that famous quote, "It is good that war is so terrible, or else men would grow too fond of it," after watching the carnage unfold on December 13th. And one more quick note I want to point out is right over here is a representation of a 30-pounder Parrott rifle. There was artillery on Lee's Hill during the battle that was firing in either direction at Marye's Heights, or at the hills, or the field in front of Marye's Heights and Prospect Hill. And one of these Parrott rifles got too hot and burst, killing the entire crew and sending chunks of hot metal into the air, just narrowly missing General Lee and General Longstreet. That's when Lee said to Longstreet, "It is not our time, it's not our time," as in saying it's not our time to die. It makes me think of how the war would have changed if the pieces of metal flying from that Parrott gun that exploded, if it hit General Lee and killed him. How would the war have changed? So by the end of the day on December 13th, General Burnside had failed to break Lee's line at either flanks, and he was back at square one. Both sides stayed where they were the next day, December 14th, in anticipation for more fighting, but no main action really took place after December 13th, and Burnside's army retreated back across the Rappahannock River in disgrace on December 15th. For their failure to capture Fredericksburg, it cost the Union Army almost 13,000 casualties, the Confederates losing about 5,000 men. It was a very lopsided affair and a humiliation for the Union Army.
That concludes my video on the Battle of Fredericksburg. Thank you all very much for watching, of course, and a big thank you to the National Park Service as well as the American Battlefield Trust for all the work they do to allow people like me to come to these battlefields and to learn more about the Civil War. If you're in the area, I highly encourage you to visit yourself.
It took 10 days for the army to fucking shit.